You know how sometimes you hear two words that seem, well, basically the same, but you just get this feeling there's a subtle difference.
Uh-huh.
Well, today, listener curiosity has led us down kind of a fascinating rabbit hole on the water, actually.
Right.
We're looking at collision versus elision.
Exactly. And the core difference, it's actually pretty straightforward when you break it down.
Okay.
Think of an elision like this. A ship bumps into something that's not moving. So maybe another ship that's anchored, or a pier, a bridge support, could be a buoy, even an oil rig.
So stationary things, got it.
Right. A collision, though, that's when two vessels hit each other, and both of them are underway, both moving.
Okay. So while maybe in everyday chat you might say, I don't know, a ferry collided with the dock.
Yeah, people say that all the time.
But there's actually a more precise term for that, especially when you get into the world of maritime law, admiralty law.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's the legal side of things happening on the water, and yeah, the terminology matters there.
So for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a mix of sources. We've got the standard dictionary definitions, Merriam-Webster, the OED.
The big ones.
Yeah. And then some legal perspectives from places like Ellis Data, the law offices of Charles D. Naylor, also Wiktionary, a really helpful explainer from NOAA.
And even some online discussions. LanguageHat.com had a good thread, and we saw something on Reddit, too, in a grammar.
Right. So our mission today, basically, is to unpack why this seemingly tiny difference in words actually matters. Where does elision even come from, and what are the, real-world consequences, especially legally?
Okay, let's maybe zoom in on elision itself first. Merriam-Webster, as you said, gives that main definition, a ship hitting something stationary. But what's interesting is they also list this older secondary meaning, says it's obsolete now. But back in 1615, it just meant the action of dashing against or striking upon anything hitting anything, really.
Huh. So it wasn't always ship-specific.
It doesn't seem like it. It's sort of specialized over the centuries, you could say.
That's pretty cool, that linguistic drift. What about the word's origins? The etymology?
Yeah, the roots are quite revealing. Merriam-Webster traces it back to late Latin, elision, alisio, which comes from the Latin verb allidere.
Okay.
And allidere means to strike against. It's built from ad, meaning to or against, and lidere, which comes from lidere, and lidere means to hurt or to injure.
Wow, okay. So the idea of causing harm or damage was baked right in from the start.
Seems that way. And Wiktionary kind of places collision alongside it as another type of nautical striking event. Coordinates, sort of.
Right. And the Oxford English Dictionary, does it add anything different?
Pretty similar story on the etymology. The OED connects allied, the verb form, to that same classical Latin allidere, and also points out the link to lidere, which is the root of our word lesion.
Ah, lesion, like an injury. There it is again.
Exactly, that sense of harm. But what's really interesting is that the OED notes that the verb allied, meaning just to hit against something, well, it was apparently quite rare before the middle of the 20th century.
Really? So people didn't really say the boat collided with the dock much?
Not commonly, according to the OED. But, crucially, they do specify its use in maritime law of a vessel to collide with another, which is stationary, or with the static object or structure.
So the legal world kind of kept it alive, or maybe even revived it for this specific purpose.
It really looks that way. That precise legal meaning seems to be what gave the term its modern legs, so to speak.
Okay, so it feels like the general concept is old, but this specific maritime law usage is maybe more recent in terms of common-ish use within that field.
That seems right.
All right, so we get the definitions, but the big question is why? Why bother having two separate words? I mean, like I said, something got hit, damage is damage rate.
Well, not exactly, especially, as you hinted, when the lawyers get involved.
Ah, yes. The lawyers.
There was this discussion over on LanguageHat.com. It came up after the Ever Given incident in the Suez Canal.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Big boat, little canal.
Right. And someone, Bill Poser actually, pointed out that technically the ship alighted with the bank. It didn't collide with it.
Because the bank isn't moving.
Okay. And the legal distinction is the key. Elisions involve one moving thing hitting something stationary. Collisions are specifically two moving things hitting each other.
And this isn't just about being picky with words, is it? There was a comment on that same thread from J.W. Brewer about fault, negligence.
Exactly. Brewer had a really sharp insight there. He suggested the whole reason for having these two terms, functionally, often boils down to figuring out who's at fault.
How so?
Well, the thinking goes something like this. A stationary object appear, an anchored ship. It's generally presumed not to be negligently placed. It's just there.
Okay. Seems reasonable.
So if a moving ship hits it, the immediate legal question tends to be, was the moving ship somehow negligent? Did it fail in its duty to, not hit the big stationary thing?
Right. The focus is on the mover.
But if two moving ships hit each other, well, then you have to look at the actions of both captains, both crews, to figure out who messed up. Or maybe both did. It's a different starting point for the investigation.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. The law just starts with a different default assumption depending on the type of impact.
Precisely. And this leads us right into something called the Oregon Rule. The law offices of Charles D. Naylor had a good explanation of this.
The Oregon Rule. Okay, what's that?
It's a legal principle, a presumption, basically, that says in an elision, the moving vessel is presumed to be at fault.
Presumed. So, like, guilty until proven innocent, almost.
Kind of. The law essentially says, hey, moving ship, you probably messed up. To overcome that presumption, the owner or operator of the moving vessel has to prove one of two things.
Which are?
Either that the stationary object somehow caused the accident, maybe it was unlit, or improperly positioned in a way they couldn't anticipate, or they have to prove the accident was completely unavoidable, an inevitable accident.
Wow, that sounds like a high bar to clear.
Mm-hmm.
The burden of proof is squarely on the moving ship.
It is. They gave a specific case example, too, Mike Hook's Dredging versus Marquette Transportation Gulf Inland LLC from 2013.
Okay, what happened there?
So, you had a moving towboat with barges hitting a dredge that was moored, tied up in a narrow channel.
Uh-oh. Moored in a narrow channel sounds maybe not ideal.
Exactly. Turns out there was a specific navigation rule, Rule 9, against mooring like that in that particular channel, and breaking a rule like that brings another rule into play.
Oh, boy. More rules.
Yep. This one's called the Pennsylvania Rule.
Okay, Pennsylvania Rule. Let's have it.
This one's even older. Comes from a Supreme Court case way back in 1871. Again, the Naylor Law Office explained it. It basically says, if a vessel violates a safety rule, like Rule 9, that was specifically designed to prevent collisions or elisions, then that vessel is automatically presumed to be partly at fault for the accident.
Automatically. Wow.
Unless, and again, it's a tough burden, unless they can prove beyond doubt that their rule breaking could not have possibly contributed to the accident.
So in that Mike Hook's case, the moored dredge broke a rule.
Right. So the Pennsylvania rule kicked in against the dredge, but the moving vessel still hit it, so the Oregon rule presumption was initially against the moving towboat.
So both had a potential fault issue.
Exactly. And because of the specifics, the court ultimately decided both were partially liable and split the damages. It shows how these rules interact in a real situation.
Man, these definitions aren't just academic, are they? They have huge real-world impacts when things go wrong, especially thinking about insurance and who pays for what.
Absolutely. And NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they also underline this practical difference.
How so?
Well, they use a general term like marine casualty or accident as an umbrella, but when they list the types of incidents that must be reported to the Coast Guard, they specifically list elision and collision as distinct occurrences.
So the official reporting recognizes the difference.
Yes. And their definitions are nice and simple, just like we discussed. Collision. Two vessels strike each other. Elision. A vessel strikes a stationary object, bridge, dock, whatever.
They must see a lot of these reports. Did they give an example?
They did. A pretty famous one, unfortunately. The MV Costco Busan hitting the San Francisco Bay Bridge back in 2007.
Oh, I remember that. Caused a big oil spill, didn't it?
It did. A major environmental incident. And NOAA points out that was an elision. The ship hit the stationary bridge tower, not a collision.
It's kind of chilling how that one word, elision, immediately frames the initial liability question in such a massive event.
It really does. Now, shifting gears slightly, that Reddit discussion we mentioned in Or Grammar, someone asked a pretty logical question from outside the legal bubble. Can you use elision for things other than boats? Like, could a car collide with a lamppost?
That's a good question. Does the term ever get used more broadly? What did the Redditors think?
The general feeling, the consensus was pretty clear. No, not really. It's overwhelmingly considered a maritime legal term.
So car hitting a wall is just hitting a wall. Or maybe colliding with a wall, depending on your style guide?
Pretty much. While the concept moving thing hits stationary things seems transferable, the word elision itself seems really anchored, pardon the pun, to the maritime world.
Nice one.
Though one user did find this incredibly rare historical example. Apparently, the 16th century poet Edmund Spenser once used the verb allied.
Spencer, like the fairy queen Spencer.
That's the one. He apparently used allied in a totally non-nautical way, talking about the collision with the fixed state of marriage.
No way. Marriage is a stationary object you allied with. That's amazing.
Isn't it? A fascinating little outlier from centuries ago, but definitely not common usage today.
Definitely not. So, back on languagechat.com, David Eddyshaw made a good point about this too, didn't he? About common understanding.
He did. He basically said, look, most people understand collide to mean two moving things hitting, and allied does fill that gap nicely for one moving thing hitting a stationary one. But he doubted that anyone outside of maritime law circles would actually know what allision means if they heard it. It's specialized jargon.
Yeah, that feels right. And J.W. Brewer, also on Language Chat, added another historical wrinkle, right? About dictionaries.
Yeah, this was interesting. He pointed out that allision actually was listed in legal dictionaries back in the 19th century.
Oh, so even though the OED thought the verb allied was rare or maybe obsolete for a while.
The noun allision seems to have had a continuous life within legal text for quite some time. Brewer suggested maybe the OED's initial obsolete tag might have been a bit off, given its persistence in law.
And the OED entry now reflects that continued use.
It does. It includes examples from American maritime cases in 1962 and the Federal Reporter in 1986, showing it was definitely still in use in legal writing through the 20th century.
It really shows how a specific field can keep a word alive for its own precise needs, even if it fades from general use.
Absolutely. You know, that language hat discussion also brought up the, shall we say, more practical, maybe cynical view?
Which is
insurance companies and lawyers. Someone suggested they probably like having these distinct terms.
What is that?
Well, think about the insurance implications. Two moving vessels crashing. That's probably a different policy situation, different liability calculations, compared to one vessel hitting a fixed insured object like a pier or a bridge.
Follow the money. Makes sense that the financial side would want that clarity or that specific terminology.
It often comes down to that, doesn't it? And they shared some funny quotes, too, kind of related to this.
Oh, yeah.
Like a supposed John von Neumann quote about asking a driver who hit a tree, "Couldn't you see the tree? Of course you could, but did you expect it to step aside?"
And there was a rock lyric mentioned, too.
Yeah, something about there was an oak tree in the road, and I hadn't seen it. Just capturing that everyday way we talk about hitting stationary things, the surprise that it was in the way.
Right. You don't usually blame the tree or the lamppost in casual talk. It's also funny that, as Language Hat noted, the AP style book apparently used to forbid saying a car collided with a tree.
Yeah. They insisted collision had to be two moving things. It apparently took a lot of arguments before they finally relaxed that rule.
Shows how, even outside of law, people debate these subtle word meanings.
Totally. And that particle physics analogy someone made was great, too.
What with that?
They pointed out that in physics, a collider, like the Large Hadron Collider, specifically smashes two beams of particles together. Moving meets moving.
Okay.
But when they shoot a single beam of particles at a stationary block of material, that's called a fixed target experiment. They don't call the target block an alligator.
No, I guess they don't. A good parallel.
It really highlights how specific terminology develops for specific needs.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The big takeaway seems clear. This collision versus allision thing. It's not just grammar nerds being pedantic.
Right at all.
It's a really fundamental legal distinction, primarily within maritime law. And it all hinges on one simple question. Was the thing that got hit moving, or was it stationary?
That's the core of it. And because of the legal framework, things like the Oregon rule, the Pennsylvania rule, that distinction immediately shapes how fault and liability are initially viewed. In an allision, the spotlight starts on the moving vessel.
Right. So just to recap the definitions one last time for everyone. Allision.
Ship hits a stationary object. Pier, anchored, boat, bridge, whatever.
Collision.
Moving ship hits another moving ship.
Got it. And while maybe in everyday conversation, we might just use collision for everything.
Which most people probably do.
Knowing the term allision actually gives you like a bit of insight into the very precise language used in nautical and legal settings, especially when things go wrong and they need to figure out who pays.
Exactly. It unlocks that layer of legal meaning.
So here's a thought to leave everyone with. Now that you know this difference, are you going to notice it more? Like, if you read a news report about a shipping incident, will you look to see if they use collision or allision? Does knowing that specific word actually help clarify the potential legal situation right from the start? It's just fascinating how fields develop their own language for precision, isn't it?
It really is. Language is always evolving, always specializing.
Well, thanks for navigating these specific linguistic waters with me today.
My pleasure. It was a good dive.
And thanks to all of you for diving deep with us. Hopefully you feel just a little bit more informed about the language of the sea.